And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Well, good morning, and welcome to The Law Show. Looking for a hero? Well, we have a couple of lawyers. Hopefully that will take care of business for the next hour here on CL 650. Sterling Fox joined in studio by Alex Stojkovic and Rudy Kisher from Maynard Kisher Stojkovic, immigration and citizenship lawyers in Vancouver. Welcome back to the program, gentlemen. Good to see you both.
Good to see you, Sterling. Great to be here.
Well, it's just a few short days. Hopefully, we've all caught up on our sleep in the wake of the longest ever election campaign in the history of Canada, which, well, has seen some colorful results. And we wanted to talk specifically about changes in government as they affect changes in the way Canada does business. And with a couple of immigration and citizenship lawyers in the studio this morning, we thought we would begin simply by asking, suppose now the government has decided we're going to do immigration very differently in the future as a result of this most recent election. So, Rudy, if the government decides to change the way Canada does immigration, how quickly could anybody in the Department of Immigration be expected to start receiving emails about the new way we're going to do business?
When I have clients come to my office and they talk about their immigration file or their potential immigration file, the first thing I tell them, we're dealing with the government, and nothing happens quickly.
Okay.
So don't expect anything quickly
from
them. And I think if people are looking to the new minister to change things the way they've done, they really have to temper their expectations on how fast things are going to happen. I mean, this new minister is going to have to, get to know the senior bureaucrats, meet with them, start to understand. We'll just be briefing on the portfolio, have to understand the portfolio, and then decide which direction that minister wants to take it. And I think that is it'll take months, most of the Immigration Act is ruled that there are regulations in place and laws in place that if major changes are going to be made, it's going
to change it in Parliament first,
they'll have to change it in Parliament, and it's going to take a long time. I mean, while there are ministerial instructions that can be done quickly, I think it'll take a long time. It'll take several months before we see any major changes.
Right, and Alex, Rudy's referred to the bureaucrats, and those are really the people who make the wheels of government go around, however quickly or slowly, and they're the people who will conduct the actual changes to any government policy, be it immigration or elsewise, and that's a considerable population of employees to change, let alone the policies they're working under.
The challenges that are going to become readily apparent right now is that anybody who is looking for major change is going to have to look at it within the context of what's happened in the last several years and how processing has changed. As we've spoken on previous shows, visa posts have been closed. Officers have been moved from outside of Canada to inside of Canada.
That's right, yeah.
Resources have been reshuffled. Much more is being done online. Much less is being done on paper. For that to change would be extremely difficult. And I think that kind of change in paradigm in terms of processing is probably unlikely going forward. So I think the changes that will occur will have to be within the context of the system that's already in place now in terms of processing. However, the government is going to have, and I agree with Rudy's point, briefing notes will have to be done by senior bureaucrats. Where are we on this point? Where are we on that point?
Sure.
Where are we on this point?
Kind of an audit, if you will, for the new person, right?
Sure. But there are some immediate things that have to be dealt with. And unfortunately, the new administration is going to have to get on those decisions pretty quickly. First, and I think we'll touch on all of these as we speak the rest of the hour, but to begin with, you're going to have to deal with the end of the year. The pilot project for Spouse in Canada is going to be terminated. It is a one-year pilot project. Someone is going to have to determine whether people who apply from within Canada are going to be entitled to an open work permit or whether they won't be. That project is up in December of this year. It's going to have to be reviewed, and someone's going to have to make a decision on whether they go forward or not. Why I'm raising that one specifically is because if you've decided that you're going to change the mix and put more resources into family class and Spouse in Canada, then maybe you don't need that pilot project anymore, because that was a stopgap measure to get people work permits while they're waiting for their cases to be processed. So that's an immediate policy decision that's essentially political and will have to be made on a political level. That doesn't need regulation or a legal change. It requires a decision to be made. In addition to that, you have new enforcement mechanisms that have come in place for employers of foreign workers. Those mechanisms include some pretty significant enforcement elements to them. Those at this point have been funded through a centralized agency. Is that funding going to increase, continue? Those are questions that have to be answered by the new government. And we'll see what kind of priority they put on it given a potential change in view on foreign workers generally. We then have another issue, and that is a lot of the provincial programs are closed now because they've reached their limits.
The provincial foreign worker programs, right?
That's right.
Okay.
So, and how is that going to play into changes in express entry? Now that the election is over, are we going to open the door wider to express entry? Are we going to allow more people to apply now that we know that going forward there's no risk of an election?
Right.
So that's another question that will have to be answered. And the challenges to doing anything radically different is that there's already resources from the budget this year that have been allocated to it. It may need a budget next year to change those resources accordingly.
Right.
Finally, and the other thing that strikes me that has to be determined and that we need to also talk about is we just signed a free trade agreement with 9 other countries.
That's right.
2 of them we have a free trade agreement with already, but now we have it with all these other countries. We haven't seen the text for professionals, for business visitors, for various other elements.
Right.
As has been widely reported in the media, there's an expectation, much like in the Korean, the Chilean, and finally the Colombian, Peruvian free trade agreements and our existing ones with Canada, and with Mexico and the United States, that there will be some element of facilitation for foreign workers.
Okay.
What's that going to look like? We've never had this kind of arrangement with Malaysia before, these other countries.
Right.
What impact is that going to have on the number of foreign workers in Canada? So that hasn't even really been digested yet because we don't know what the final text looks like.
I think, too, in terms of family class, a quota that's going to come up right away is every year, usually January 2nd, opens up, which used to be a large class, was sponsoring parents and grandparents.
Right, okay.
That has been cut back significantly to where only 5,000 applications are accepted every year. So what happens now, in December, people get their applications ready and send it off. I think the new minister is going to have to take a look at that and say, where do we stand on this family class? Are we going to, looking at the results of the election, do we sort of expand it or do we stick and hold? Because that number doesn't need to go to Parliament. That is basically a decision by the minister, and he'll have to either sign off, we're going to go with the same old that's always been going along, or make a decision, which, that there are people that are for years now looking at, they want to bring their parents or their grandparents, and now the backlog is, if someone comes into my office, they say, you're looking at 10 years. So, your grandma's now 70.
Right.
You could come in today, she's not getting here till she's 80. No, that's the reality.
We didn't talk a lot, or the matters of citizenship and immigration weren't terribly widely discussed during that incredibly long election campaign. But one matter in this file that did get a considerable amount of attention from both the players and certainly the media was the refugee crisis that's currently underway in the Middle East, as it might affect Canada. And we had promises made by various players as to the large numbers of refugees they were going to insist we bring in quite short order. And again, Alex, let's start with you on this. When we hear these promises that may appeal to our sense of global justice or whatever, we still must temper whatever emotional strings it pulls with the fact that it can't be done overnight, no matter how convincingly the case is presented.
Well, I mean, in this instance, though, and although I would agree with your general point, Sterling, and I know that Rudy and Gordon debated this issue on a whole other episode, but the baseline here on the Syrian refugee crisis is so low from the government side that really any amount of resources thrown on it will be an enormous change.
Improvement.
In terms of impact.
Right, okay.
Well, I don't want to say improvement. I mean, it's ultimately a political decision here how many what number of refugees we take.
True.
I mean, that's not a legal decision, it's a political one. But if you're committing to, like the federal government did, to bringing in a certain number of people, and then you fail to meet that by a wide range.
Right.
And what's more, you really vet them at a very senior political level, which is what the Harper government was accused of doing through the PMO's office.
Right.
You're not going to have fast processing. That's just not realistic. And by deferring to a third-party agency like the UNHCR, you're depending on their resources to make those choices for you.
Right.
To give you some context, whatever your views were on the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, the refugee portion of that, the Kosovars that had fled into Albania and into Macedonia and into Montenegro, the Canadian government, because there was a political will to do something about it, sent officers, and they processed them right then and there in the hundreds in a matter of days, not 218 months like the current government has done.
Right.
So, if there's enough political will, sure, there's limits within resources we have. But I should point out that $130 million of the refugee budget last year was unspent and sent back into
General revenue?
General revenue.
And anybody who's worked in a bureaucracy.
And you worked for the United
I
Nations
worked for
High
the UN,
Commission for Refugees.
and I can
yes.
tell you, from what I can see of working in a bureaucracy, that is the death knell of a department. The minute you don't use every last dollar that is sent to you, the thought is your budget starting amount, the negotiation goes down by what you didn't spend. Well, you obviously didn't need that money last year,
right.
So we're not giving it to you this year. You got to justify and scrape. So in most bureaucracy, it's you spend that money whether you need to or not.
I was going to say, I thought that was the unwritten rule of all bureaucracies. You absolutely.
I'm surprised it's not in writing, actually. I thought it was.
You have to spend every penny they give you, otherwise they won't give you more next year.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is $130 million out of that refugee budget for 2014 went unspent.
Unbelievable.
So if they simply spent the money that was allocated last year, we would be a lot closer to the targets. Now, whether those targets are what people think is appropriate or not is a different question.
Because we heard quite a variation in numbers over the past few weeks of, if we become government, we'd like to bring in this many refugees. And they were sort of outplaying each other with higher numbers and playing that game that can be dangerous.
Well,
I think
Justin's figure on the campaign was close to 50,000. I think he was talking about by January or something. So I mean, you take a look at those numbers and you say to yourself, they're not possible. Number one, right? I mean, that there's not the manpower there and the ability, even with the political will, to get numbers that high. But can they move from where they're at? Clearly, this government. Clearly this government's going to have a lot of choices to make on this file, because it was a political. I would say one of the top 4 political issues that sort of surprised people on the campaign.
The refugee matter.
The refugee
you're right,
matter.
because there were no other citizenship or immigration matters that came up at all. But the refugee crisis, they had to handle it. It was unavoidable.
I am sorry to say there was one, and involved a veil at a citizenship ceremony.
A little matter of the niqab. We'll talk about that when we come back. This is The Law Show. Our guests are Alex Stojkovic and Rudy Kisher from Maynard Kisher Stojkovic, immigration and citizenship lawyers here in Vancouver at 1168 Hamilton Street downtown, and online at vancouverlaw.ca. Back with lots more right after this.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 6.